David always believed in the art of precision. His life in New York was like one of the interiors he meticulously designed for his clients. Flawless, intentional, and perfectly curated. Every detail had its place, every choice had its purpose. And at the center of it all was Emily, his wife of 7 years. She wasn't just his muse. She was his anchor, his partner, the calm in the storm of a chaotic world. To David, their marriage wasn't just a union. It was a sanctuary. A place where trust and love were the foundation of everything. But trust, as David would soon discover, is fragile, like glass. It can appear strong and unyielding, but one crack is all it takes to shatter it into irreparable fragments. It started innocently enough, a Tuesday morning like any other. The kind of morning that feels routine, yet comforting in its familiarity. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled their chic Manhattan apartment as Emily moved gracefully through the space, gathering her things for work. She looked effortlessly stunning. As always, her caramel hair swept into a loose bun and her tailored blazer hugging her frame perfectly. David watched her from across the kitchen island, sipping his coffee and marveling at how seamlessly she fit into the life they'd built together. "I have to go to Chicago," Emily said suddenly, breaking the rhythm of their usual morning banter. Her tone was casual, too casual. David raised an eyebrow, setting his mug down. "Chicago? For what?" "Work," she replied quickly, her eyes fixed on her phone as she typed furiously. "There's a last-minute marketing conference I need to attend. It's only for 3 days." Something about the way she said it made David pause. Emily was meticulous when it came to her schedule. She planned everything weeks in advance with precision that rivaled his own. A spontaneous trip felt out of character. 3 days, he repeated, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. She finally looked up from her phone and flashed him that disarming smile, the one that had captivated him from the moment they met. "Yeah, I know it's sudden, but it's really important. I'll be back before you know it." And just like that, the conversation ended. She kissed him on the cheek, grabbed her suitcase, and walked out the door with an air of confidence that left no room for questions. David stood there for a moment longer than usual, staring at the spot where she'd been just seconds ago. Something felt off, like a wrong note in an otherwise perfect melody, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The first day without Emily passed uneventfully. David buried himself in work, sketching layouts and selecting color palettes for a new client's penthouse renovation. But by the second day, that nagging feeling returned, the kind of itch you can't ignore no matter how hard you try. He decided to call Emily that evening to check in. She didn't answer. He sent her a text instead. "Hey babe, how's Chicago? Hope the conference isn't too boring." Her reply came hours later. "Busy day? Sorry I missed your call. Love you." The words were there, the right words, but something about them felt hollow. By the third day, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He was sitting at his desk when his phone buzzed with a notification from an old college friend he hadn't spoken to in years. It was a video link with no context other than a short message. "Hey man, isn't this your wife?" David clicked on the link without hesitation. The video loaded slowly, his heart pounding faster with every passing second, and then it appeared. A shaky clip filmed at what looked like an upscale rooftop party in Miami. Not Chicago. His breath caught in his throat as he spotted her. Emily, dressed in a sleek black dress he didn't recognize. She was laughing, her head tilted back in that carefree way he adored so much. But she wasn't alone. Standing next to her was a man David had never seen before, a tall guy with sharp features and an easy charm that made David's stomach churn violently. The man leaned closer to whisper something in Emily's ear, and she smiled. A smile that wasn't meant for David. David froze as time seemed to grind to a halt around him. The sounds of New York outside faded into nothingness as he replayed the video over and over again, hoping, praying, that he'd misunderstood what he was seeing. But there was no misunderstanding it. Emily wasn't in Chicago at some marketing conference like she'd claimed. She was in Miami with another man. The realization hit him like a freight train, sudden and brutal, and left him gasping for air as questions flooded his mind. Who is this guy? How long has this been going on? Why would she lie? Why would she betray me? David stared at his phone screen until it went dark, leaving only his reflection staring back at him. A stranger he barely recognized anymore. Confusion turned into anger, Anger twisted into heartbreak. Heartbreak hardened into resolve. If there's one thing David knew how to do well, it was paying attention to detail. The subtle interplay of light and shadow, or how textures complemented each other perfectly in design. And now those same skills would serve him well as he set out to uncover every detail of Emily's betrayal. Because if their marriage really was like one of his carefully crafted interiors, someone had knocked over a vase and left shards of glass scattered across the floor. And David wasn't going to let those shards stay there, not without finding out exactly who had broken them first. This wasn't just about love anymore. It was about truth. And David would stop at nothing to find it. Part 2. The Truth Unveiled. David couldn't sleep that night. The video replayed in his mind like a haunting melody, each frame a sharp note that cut deeper than the last. He could see it all so vividly. The way Emily tilted her head back as she laughed, her carefree smile lighting up the rooftop party. The way the man leaned in close, his lips brushing her ear like he belonged there. And worst of all, the way her hand lingered on his arm, a touch so intimate it made David's stomach churn. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung, it was the ease with which she had lied to him. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had built a life with, was suddenly a stranger. But David wasn't one to act impulsively. No, he was meticulous, a man who thrived on precision and detail. It was what made him successful in his career as a designer, and now it would be his greatest weapon in uncovering the truth. If Emily thought she could deceive him, she had underestimated just how far he would go to unravel her web of lies. The first step was to trace the origins of the video. He called his old college friend, the one who had sent it to him, and asked the question that had been gnawing at him since he first saw it. "Where did you get this?" "It popped up on my feed," his friend replied casually. "Someone posted it on social media. I thought I recognized her, so I sent it your way." David felt a chill run down his spine. Social media, the modern graveyard of secrets. He spent hours that night scouring Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, following every breadcrumb until he found the original post. It belonged to an influencer who seemed to specialize in documenting her glamorous life in Miami. The caption read, "Amazing night at the rooftop party. Love this crowd." And there she was, Emily, standing in the background of one of the photos, her face illuminated by string lights and laughter. She looked radiant, almost glowing, as if she didn't have a care in the world. But it wasn't just her presence that struck David, it was who she was with. The same man from the video stood beside her, his arm casually draped across her chair. David saved every photo and video he could find, creating a folder on his computer labeled Evidence. The word felt cold and clinical, but it was necessary. If Emily tried to deny what he'd seen, and David suspected she would, he needed proof. The next step was identifying the man who had so casually inserted himself into David's life without permission. David zoomed in on every image, scrutinizing every detail like a detective piecing together a crime scene. He noticed a watch on the man's wrist, sleek and expensive, and a tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve. These clues led him down another rabbit hole of online research until he finally found a name: Ryan Carter. Ryan Carter was everything David wasn't. A flashy marketing executive based in Miami who seemed to live for rooftop parties and luxury vacations. His social media profile was a highlight reel of excess: fast cars, private jets, beachside resorts, and an endless parade of beautiful women. And now Emily was one of them. David stared at Ryan's profile for what felt like hours, his emotions swinging wildly between anger and heartbreak. How long had this been going on? How had Emily, a woman who once claimed she couldn't stand superficiality, fallen for someone like this? And most importantly, why? By now, David had enough evidence to confront Emily directly. But something held him back, a voice deep inside urging him to wait. He didn't just want answers, he wanted closure. He needed to understand why she had done this before deciding what came next. When Emily returned home from her trip, she walked through the door with her usual bright smile and kissed David on the cheek as if nothing had happened. "How was Chicago?" David asked casually, watching her closely for any flicker of hesitation. "It was good," she replied smoothly, setting down her suitcase. "Busy but productive." David felt anger bubble beneath his calm exterior. How could she lie so effortlessly? But he kept his composure and nodded along as she launched into stories about meetings and presentations that never happened. That night, as Emily slept soundly beside him, David lay awake staring at the ceiling. He felt trapped between two versions of reality, the one Emily presented to him and the one he knew to be true. It was like living in two parallel worlds that couldn't coexist. The next morning, David decided it was time for answers. While Emily was at work, or so she claimed, he called her office under the pretense of needing help with something urgent. "Emily's not here," said her coworker when David asked for her. "Not there," David repeated, feigning confusion. "She's out of town," they explained matter-of-factly. "She mentioned being in Miami for some marketing event." David hung up without another word, his hands trembling as he set down his phone. Miami. She hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks properly. The lie wasn't just a betrayal. It was an insult to his intelligence. At this point, David knew there was no turning back. He couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore, not when the truth stared him in the face every time he looked at her. But instead of confronting Emily immediately, David decided to dig deeper into Ryan's connection with her. Through more research and subtle questioning of mutual acquaintances, he discovered that Emily and Ryan had met months ago at a marketing conference in Chicago, ironically enough. Their affair had started shortly after that meeting and continued under the guise of business trips and networking events. The realization hit David like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a calculated deception spanning months. Every moment they'd shared during that time felt tainted now. A beautiful painting ruined by careless strokes of betrayal. But amidst all the pain and anger brewing inside him, David felt something else: clarity. He realized that confronting Emily wasn't just about exposing her lies. It was about reclaiming control over his life and finding closure for himself. And so, armed with every piece of evidence he'd collected, the photos, videos, social media posts, David prepared himself for what would undoubtedly be one of the hardest conversations of his life. Because sometimes uncovering the truth isn't just about finding answers. It's about rediscovering yourself amidst all the chaos someone else has left behind. Part 3. The Plan for Revenge. David sat alone in the dim light of his living room, the glow of his laptop illuminating the storm brewing within him. His hands hovered over the keyboard, motionless, as his mind raced with thoughts he never imagined he'd entertain. He wasn't a vengeful man by nature. He had always believed in forgiveness and second chances. But this wasn't something he could forgive. Emily hadn't just broken his heart. She had shattered it into jagged pieces, leaving him bleeding from wounds he didn't deserve. And the worst part? She didn't even seem to care. The betrayal burned in his chest like a fire that refused to be extinguished. It wasn't just the affair with Ryan. It was the lies, the deceit, and the ease with which she had looked him in the eye and pretended everything was fine. 7 years of marriage reduced to ashes by her selfish choices. David knew he couldn't let this go, not without making her understand the weight of what she had done. But David was not impulsive. He was methodical, a man who thrived on precision and planning. It was what made him successful as a designer, and now it would be his greatest weapon. If Emily thought she could outsmart him, she had underestimated just how far he was willing to go to expose her lies. The gathering storm. The first step was collecting evidence. Every piece of proof he could find that would leave no room for denial or manipulation. He spent hours combing through social media, saving every photo and video that showed Emily and Ryan together. He printed out screenshots of their text messages and emails, each one a dagger aimed at her carefully constructed facade. Every detail went into a folder labeled Truth, a name that felt both empowering and final. But David didn't stop there. He wanted to ensure that when Emily's betrayal was revealed, it would be undeniable. So he hired a private investigator, a man named Jack who came highly recommended by one of David's clients. Jack was discreet, thorough, and relentless in his pursuit of answers. Within days, Jack provided David with damning evidence: photos of Emily and Ryan at luxury hotels, receipts for expensive dinners they had shared, and even surveillance footage from one of their trips. As David reviewed the evidence late one night, he felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. It wasn't satisfaction, it was clarity. For weeks, he had felt powerless, a victim trapped in someone else's story. But now Now he held all the cards. The perfect plan. David knew a simple confrontation wouldn't suffice. Emily was skilled at deflecting blame. She would twist her lies into half-truths or try to manipulate him into forgiving her. No, this required something more calculated, something that would leave her no escape. That's when the idea struck him: a party. Emily loved parties. She thrived on being the center of attention, basking in admiration from friends and acquaintances who adored her charm and wit. What better way to reveal the truth than in front of an audience? It would be poetic justice, a public reckoning for someone who had spent months hiding behind lies. David began planning meticulously. He chose a date 2 weeks away and sent out invitations to their closest friends and family under the guise of celebrating their anniversary. A cruel irony that wasn't lost on him. Everyone RSVP'd eagerly, none suspecting what lay beneath the surface. Meanwhile, David worked on creating a presentation for the party, a slideshow that would tell the story of their marriage from beginning to end. It started with photos from their wedding day. Emily radiant in her white dress, David looking at her with nothing but love in his eyes. But as the slideshow progressed, it took a darker turn. The happy photos gave way to screenshots of text messages between Emily and Ryan, images of them together at hotels and parties, receipts for trips they had taken without David's knowledge. The final slide was a video, a compilation of clips showing Emily laughing and flirting with Ryan at various events. David watched the slideshow over and over again in private, ensuring every detail was perfect. This wasn't just about exposing Emily. It was about telling a story that everyone at the party would understand, a story about trust betrayed and love destroyed. The day of reckoning. On the day of the party, David felt an eerie calm as guests began arriving at their apartment. He greeted everyone warmly, making small talk as if nothing were amiss. Emily played her part perfectly too, laughing and chatting with friends like she didn't have a care in the world. As the evening wore on, David waited for just the right moment to make his move. When everyone had gathered in the living room with drinks in hand, he stood up and tapped his glass to get their attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "As you know, we're here to celebrate our anniversary, a milestone that means so much to me." He glanced at Emily as he said this, noting how her smile faltered ever so slightly. "But tonight isn't just about looking back," David continued. "It's also about being honest, with ourselves and with each other." With that, he picked up a remote control and pressed play on the slideshow. The room fell silent as images flashed across the screen. Their wedding day, vacations they had taken together, moments filled with love and laughter. But then came the screenshots, the messages between Emily and Ryan, and gasps filled the room as people realized what they were seeing. Emily's face turned pale as she stared at the screen in disbelief. "David, what is this?" she stammered. "This," David said calmly but firmly, "is what you've been hiding from me, and from everyone else." The slideshow continued until it reached its final slide, the video of Emily and Ryan together at one of their rooftop parties in Miami. By now, everyone in the room was staring at Emily, not with admiration or respect, but with shock and disappointment. David turned to face her directly. "I trusted you," he said quietly but with conviction. "I gave you my heart, and this is how you repaid me." For once, Emily had no words, no excuses or justifications that could undo what had just been revealed. Closure. For David, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about freedom. Freedom from lies, freedom from pain, freedom to start anew without someone who didn't value what they had shared. Because sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about letting go so you can finally move forward. And as David watched Emily crumble under the weight of her own deceit, he realized something profound. Betrayal doesn't define you. It frees you to reclaim your life on your own terms. This wasn't just an ending. It was a new beginning for him. Part 4. The Truth Revealed. David stood in the center of the room, his heart pounding so fiercely he swore it echoed off the walls. The air was thick with anticipation, a strange cocktail of tension and curiosity that made the living room feel smaller than it was. Friends, family, and colleagues filled the space, their laughter and chatter bouncing off the polished floors. They thought they were here to celebrate an anniversary, a milestone of love and commitment. But David knew better. Tonight wasn't about celebration, it was about revelation. Across the room, Emily was in her element. She moved effortlessly from one group to another, her emerald green dress shimmering under the chandelier's glow. Her laughter rang out like music, charming everyone as she always did. She looked radiant, confident, and completely unaware of what was about to unfold. David watched her closely, feeling a pang, not of love, but of sorrow. How had they ended up here? How had the woman he once adored become someone capable of such betrayal? Taking a deep breath, David tapped his glass lightly with a spoon. The sound cut through the noise like a blade, silencing conversations and drawing all eyes to him. Emily turned toward him, her smile unwavering but tinged with curiosity. "Thank you all for coming tonight," David began, his voice steady but carrying an edge that only he could feel. "It means so much to have you here as we celebrate. Well, as we celebrate our journey together." He paused deliberately, letting his words hang heavy in the air. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. 7 years, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Emily. 7 years of love, trust, and partnership. At least, that's what I thought. The murmurs started immediately, soft whispers exchanged between guests who sensed something wasn't right. Emily's smile faltered slightly, confusion flickering across her face. David reached for the remote control sitting on the coffee table and held it up for everyone to see. "Tonight," he said evenly, "I want to share something with all of you, something I've been holding on to for far too long." With a click of the button, the large TV screen mounted on the wall flickered to life. The room fell silent as images began to appear. Photos from their wedding day, snapshots from vacations they had taken together, moments frozen in time that told the story of their life as husband and wife. Emily's expression softened as she watched their memories play out on screen. For a fleeting moment, David saw something genuine in her eyes, a glimmer of what they once shared. But then the slideshow shifted. The happy photos faded into something darker, screenshots of text messages exchanged between Emily and Ryan Carter, the man she had been seeing behind David's back. The messages were explicit and undeniable proof of their affair. Gasps filled the room as guests realized what they were looking at. Emily's face drained of color as she stared at the screen in disbelief. "David, what is this?" she stammered. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he pressed forward with the slideshow. More evidence appeared, photos of Emily and Ryan together at hotels and parties, receipts for trips they had taken without David knowing. Each image was like another dagger piercing through the illusion she had tried so hard to maintain. By now, everyone in the room was staring at Emily, not with admiration or respect, but with shock and disappointment. David turned to face her directly. His voice was calm but firm as he said, "This is what you've been hiding from me, and from everyone else." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked around desperately for support, but found none. Every face in the room mirrored David's pain and betrayal. The final slide appeared on screen, a video compilation showing Emily laughing and flirting with Ryan at various events. It was undeniable proof that everything she had told David about her work trips had been a lie. For once in her life, Emily was speechless. David took a step closer to her and said quietly but with conviction, "I trusted you. I gave you my heart, and this is how you repaid me." The room remained silent except for the faint sound of someone crying softly in the corner, a friend who couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Emily finally found her voice and said weakly, "David, I can explain." But he shook his head firmly and replied, "There's nothing left to explain. You made your choices, and now it's time for me to make mine." Turning back to their guests, David said clearly and confidently, "Thank you all for being here tonight, for witnessing this moment of truth." He paused before adding with finality, "Sometimes love isn't enough when trust is broken." And with that simple yet powerful statement, David walked out of the room, leaving behind not just Emily, but also the shattered remnants of their marriage. Liberation. As David stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. For months he had lived under the weight of lies and deceit, a prisoner in his own home. But tonight marked a turning point. Tonight wasn't just about exposing Emily. It was about reclaiming himself. Because sometimes revealing the truth isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about freedom. Freedom from lies. Freedom from pain. Freedom to start anew without someone who didn't value what you shared. And for perhaps the first time in months, David felt free. This wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. Part 5. A meaningful ending. David walked out of the apartment that night, leaving behind the gasps, the whispers, and the weight of 7 years of betrayal. The cool night air hit his face like a wave of clarity, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt as though he could finally breathe. It wasn't the kind of breath you take when you're relaxed or happy. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of breath you take when you've been drowning and finally break through to the surface, gasping for life itself. He didn't know where he was going. His feet moved on their own, carrying him through the quiet streets of New York City. The city buzzed around him, cars honking, laughter spilling from crowded bars, the hum of distant music, but it all felt muted, like he was walking through a dream. Or perhaps a nightmare. He wasn't sure anymore. David found himself at a small park he used to visit when he first moved to the city. It was late, and the benches were mostly empty except for a man sleeping under a worn blanket. David sat down on one of them, staring at the fountain in front of him. The water sparkled under the streetlights, each droplet catching the light like tiny diamonds. He thought about how something so simple could be so beautiful, and wondered if his life could ever feel that way again. For years, David had built his life like he designed his interiors, carefully, deliberately, with an eye for detail and a heart full of hope. And yet here he was now, sitting alone in a park in the middle of the night, trying to make sense of how everything had crumbled around him. But as he sat there in silence, something shifted inside him. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was something quieter, something steadier. It was acceptance. David realized that he couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't undo Emily's betrayal or erase the pain she had caused him. But what he could do was decide how he would move forward. He could choose to let this define him, or he could choose to let it transform him into someone stronger, rebuilding himself. The next morning, David woke up in his apartment, alone for the first time in years. The silence was deafening at first, but as he made himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window watching the city come alive, he realized something. Silence wasn't so bad. It gave him space to think, to reflect, to rebuild. And rebuild he did. David threw himself into his work with a passion he hadn't felt in years. Designing spaces had always been his escape, a way to create order out of chaos, and now it became his salvation. He started taking on projects that challenged him creatively, ones that pushed him beyond his comfort zone and forced him to think differently. But it wasn't just about work. David also began focusing on himself in ways he never had before. He started running every morning in Central Park, letting the rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement clear his mind and ground him in the present moment. He took up painting, a hobby he hadn't touched since college, and found solace in blending colors on canvas, creating something beautiful out of nothing. And slowly but surely, David began to heal. It wasn't easy. There were nights when memories of Emily crept into his mind uninvited. Her smile, her laugh, her lies, and left him staring at the ceiling until dawn. There were moments when he saw couples holding hands on the street and felt a pang of longing so sharp it made him catch his breath. But through it all, David reminded himself that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about learning to carry that pain without letting it weigh him down. Finding meaning. Months passed, and one day David found himself standing outside an art gallery in Soho, where one of his paintings was being displayed as part of an exhibit. It was a piece he had painted during one of his darkest moments, a swirling mix of blues and grays that captured both his sorrow and resilience. As he stood there looking at it, a woman approached him, a fellow artist who had noticed his work from across the room. "This is beautiful," she said softly, her eyes lingering on the painting before meeting his gaze. "It's raw and honest, like it's telling a story." David smiled, a real smile this time, and replied simply, "It is." They talked for hours that night about art and life and everything in between. Her name was Claire, and she had a warmth about her that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For the first time since Emily's betrayal, David felt something stir inside him. Hope. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something just as important, the belief that love was still possible. Over time, David and Claire grew closer. Not because they were trying to fill voids in each other's lives, but because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. She didn't try to fix him or erase his past. She simply accepted him as he was, flaws and all. And David realized that maybe that's what love was supposed to be all along. Not perfect or easy, but real and honest. A new beginning. One evening, as David stood on the balcony of his new apartment, a space he had designed entirely for himself, he looked out at the city skyline and thought about how far he had come. He thought about Emily, not with anger or bitterness, but with gratitude for what their relationship had taught him about trust and resilience. He thought about Claire, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as proof that life could surprise you when you least expected it. And most importantly, he thought about himself, not as someone who had been broken, but as someone who had been rebuilt stronger than before. Because if there was one thing David knew now more than ever, it was this: life isn't about avoiding pain. It's about finding meaning in it. And as long as you're willing to keep moving forward, there's always hope for something better waiting just around the corner. The end.